So this video is going to focus on jury decision making, which is quite a large chunk of the content that you're expected to know for criminal psychology. If you look at the screen, you can see the clip from what the specification is asking, and it's asking for you to understand the factors that influence jury decision making, including specifically characteristics of the defendant and pre-trial publicity, and also studies within this area. Now, it's also suggested that you need to know one piece of research evidence for each point, so try and have a balanced research in case this is a 16 marker, and I'll show you an example of what this might look like at the very end of the video. Just as an introduction though, just to be clear, that 12 adults are what make up a jury for one criminal cases. There are strict rules that they have to follow during the trial to make sure that the case is confidential, but it also protects the jury members from any influences on their judgment other than what evidence will be presented to them for court. So for example, if there's been media interest in a case that's been reported in the news. Now this is to make sure that the decisions that the jury make are based solely on the facts of the case that's told to them in court. The main role of the jury members is to decide as a group if they decide that the defendant is guilty or not guilty of the crime that they've been charged with. They are not deciding the sentence that somebody is given. Now, a judge cannot decide if someone is guilty or is not guilty, nor can the judge tell the jury what they need to decide. So the jury, therefore, is entirely reliant on the information that's been given to them in the court, and the judge is entirely reliant on the information and the decision that's reached by the jury. And therefore the role of the jury is very important within our criminal justice system. But there are a roll of factors that have been known to affect jury decision making, which may happen at different types of time during the trial process. I'm going to break these down into the subheadings that they give you under the spec. So if we look at the pre-trial information first. Now, the publicity surrounding the offence, the defendant, or any other information about the case we know can influence the schemas that the jury are holding about those people involved. Now, what's communicated within the media, whether that's via the news or whether that's social media, can create a perception of the defendant or anybody else that's been involved before the official information has been given to the jury within court. And we know it's difficult to change these perceptions once they've been formed. Now, pre-trial publicity can include two types of information. It can be factual or it can be emotional publicity. Now, the former is more likely to include incriminating information about the defendant or the case, such as what's happened during the crime. But emotional publicity may not contain incriminating information, but is likely to present information that could arouse negative emotions. So this might be information about the defendant's past or the victim's past, for example. And emotional publicity is also considered to have a much longer lasting influence on the jury makers than the factual information, which can be readdressed within the type of time within the trial, because more information about what's happened is presented to the jury. Now, Stabley et al. In 1999 investigated the effect of pre-trial publicity on juror verdicts by undertaking a meta-analysis of 44 empirical tests representing 5,755 subjects. Basically, it's a great sample. And they found that jurors exposed to negative pre-trial publicity were significantly more likely to judge that defendant as guilty compared to those who were exposed to less or no negative pre-trial publicity. So this is showing that if the jurors are exposed to pre-trial publicity, it can have a real negative effect on the outcome for the defendant. Now, this was more likely in cases involving murder, sexual abuse, or drugs, or when there were multiple pieces of negative information present. It was also noted to be the case where there was a greater length of time between the exposure to the publicity and the judgment. Also under pre-trial can become competence and instructions. Now, juries are expected to listen to very technical information which might be far outside of their own knowledge base, and they're also tasked with making an informed decision about guilt as a result of this technical evidence that's presented to them. Now, Forster-Lee et al. In 1993 found that giving these instructions to jury members before the presentation of the technical influence rather than afterwards actually increases their ability to focus on this information during the trial. Now, this is suggesting that giving instructions helped them to filter out the irrelevant information that was presented to them and actually increase their ability as a non-technical jury member to make sense of the evidence that's been presented to them. Again, Levitt and Cavera in 2003 shown that juries have different difficulty evaluating what specific evidence is inaccurate or not, and actually following cross-examination by other experts can really create difficulties in their understanding of the meaning of the evidence. Now, Severance and Loftus in 1982 have shown that having key terms explained to the jury, such as what's meant by reasonable doubt, for example, improved their understanding of their legal concepts, though not all demonstrated understanding even after it had been explained to them. But at least these explanations appeared to assist this idea of jury understanding by having some familiarity of these terms that were presented in the courtroom. But it does little to improve their understanding of what is more legal. Now, Reifman et al. In 1992 found that real juries' comprehension of the instructions they receive at trial isn't actually very good, and this is also something that has been suggested by mock juries who've participated in jury research. So during the trial, now defendant characteristics such as race, gender, appearance can bias the jury based on stereotypes that the juries may have toward these individuals. I'm going to come back to this on a separate slide because it's so big. Now, expert witness testimony is often used to give scientific credibility to evidence to help clarify complex issues. Experts warning the jury about the reliability of certain witness evidence does reduce the trust in such evidence, but it doesn't necessarily allow them to discriminate between good and bad evidence. Now, research has shown that even though expert witnesses may be called to warn the juries about the problems with eyewitness testimony, for example, the juries tend to just disregard these warnings and they still believe the eyewitness accounts. Now, Cutler et al. In 1989 demonstrated that juries were more likely to give guilty verdicts when expert witnesses were used to understand language, suggesting that this use of language can influence the opinion of the jury as well. Now, story models are another example of within trial influences. So when faced with particularly complex information, a jury is likely to pick up key information or facts and use these to create a story in their own minds of what happened to help them to make sense of the information that's been given to them. But Pennington and Hasty showed that if a jury is given an account of an offence in an audit in a way that was easy for them to understand in the first place, 78% of these participants in their role of a jury gave guilty verdicts, compared to 31% if the information was not given to them in a logical order. Now, this suggests that legal representatives, so lawyers within a court, should consider how they're structuring their legal arguments, because this can be used as a means of potentially influencing the outcome of the trial. So post-trial, so after the trial. Conformity is when an individual gives up his or her personal views under group pressure. Now, within a jury situation, there are two types of conformity that may occur, so normative and informational. In the latter case, the individual conforms to the group norms because they don't know what to do, and they look to the group for guidance. So it might be that an individual doesn't understand the legal technicalities of the case, for example. Whereas with normative conformity, the jury member will conform to avoid rejection from that group or to gain rewards from them that they might not necessarily really agree with in terms of the decision. Now, Ash in the 50s, in one of the most famous psychological studies of all time, found that the most influential group size to gain conformity was about 7 to 1. Now, he showed that difficult tasks and the higher status of some group members will also influence other people to conform. So if it's a particularly scientific or expert-led trial, for example, or if somebody within the jury has got a high status, so they might have been an ex-police officer, or they might have been somebody who's been, perceived to have a specific interest or intelligence or information, for example, within that trial. Now, the understanding of the jury in the Vicky Price trial in February 2013 was quite questionable. This is an example. Now, she was the wife of a politician. She was accused of falsely admitting that she was driving the car for her husband at the time, Chris Hume, who was an MP, was caught speeding. Now, the jury listened to all the information, and they were at the stage where they started to discuss the decisions amongst themselves, which is the deliberation stage. And they were asked some basic questions that raised significant concerns to the judge about their understanding of the information that had been presented to them. Now, because the defendant faced a possible prison sentence if they were convicted, it was really important that the jury fully understood their role. And actually, as a result, in this situation, the judge considered that he had no choice but to dismiss the first jury entirely, select a new one, and hold a retrial in the hope that they would understand and be able to make an informed decision. Now, actually, this is quite unusual, but it does highlight that the jury is expected to have a sufficient knowledge of the English language, but also think about the skills, this ability to evaluate evidence being presented to them to reach a judgment. Now, there can also be a minority influence as well, so it's not necessarily requiring a large number of individuals to influence the decision of one jury. Now, Moscovovi actually suggested that one or a small minority of like-minded individuals can actually influence the majority. And he found that this can be the case if they're very consistent and committed to their beliefs and opinions, and also if they're viewed to be acting on kind of moral principles. So they're not trying to gain something for themselves or get some sort of cost here. You know, they're coming across as very moral and compassionately committed to their opinions. Now, it also helps if they're coming across as a minority, but if they're equally seen to be listening to other people's opinions and arguments and taking those on board, and that can mean that the minority influence is more powerful. Social loafing, again, is this idea that not everyone who serves on a jury is actually motivated to attend. So a lot of people are there just because they've been told they have to be, because they've been summoned by the court. And therefore, when they're deliberating in the jury and making their decision, these people might be less bothered. And actually, social loafing is referring to this reduction in an individual effort in that collaborative task. So, for example, they might not be expressing what they think, they might just be going along with it because they want to go home, they don't want to be there, they didn't want to be selected for jury service in the first place. And again, foreperson influence. Now, this is the idea that all juries will have a foreperson. They're elected by themselves, so they select them and they have to present the information back to the judge in the court of law. Now, the foreperson is often perceived as this idea of a leader, and the selection of the foreperson can reflect this. Now, leaders are more likely to influence other people as they're considered the best place to make a decision. And if this individual has an authoritarian personality, for example, this might have further influence across the other jury members. And evidence of the influence of the foreperson is more limited than other post-trial factors. Now, this suggests that the trial process is very vulnerable at many stages, and as the jury members are susceptible to influence throughout the process, even before being selected as a jury member and after the evidence has been presented. Now, defendant characteristics. Most research regarding race has focused on the relationship between white jurors and black or white defendants. The common finding has been that white jurors in mock trials demonstrate negative bias to black defendants during the sentence decisions, giving them harsher sentences when compared to white defendants. Now, a similar racial bias has been shown during verdict decisions, with more black defendants being found guilty than white defendants. Now, Bradbury and Williams, in their 2013 study, and I'm hoping that things are flashing in your mind now because this is your contemporary study that you need to know inside now, found that black defendants are less likely to be convicted by juries composed of a higher proportion of black jurors, and they're more likely to be convicted by juries composed of a higher proportion of white or Hispanic jurors. Now, Skolnick and Shaw in 1997, however, found that white jury members of the same ethnic race as the defendant were less likely to find the defendant guilty, and white jurors were more likely to find black defendants not guilty than guilty. Now, Blender and Hoff undertook mock jury research in 2001. Now, their mock trials involved black, white and Hispanic defendants, and their study seemed to investigate both race and attractiveness. Now, black participants showed leniency to defendants of their own race, whereas Hispanics showed the opposite. White participants didn't seem to show any ethnic bias at all, and this suggests that racial bias has a more complicated effect on jury decision-making than we first assumed. Now, defendants are also instructed when they're going to court to present themselves in a smart and tidy fashion, and even if this isn't how they normally would dress. Now, this can help to reduce any negative stereotypes that the jury may have against them based on a more casual appearance, and will influence how the jury may find them. Now, evidence for this was found within a Wender and Hoff study in terms of female jurors who were found to be harsher on an unattractive defendant than they were an attractive one. Interestingly, though, male jurors showed the exact opposite effect. Now, think about this. Villains in films are often portrayed as unattractive. They're presented as unattractive, untrustworthy, and the bad guys, whereas the good guys, your superheroes, etc., all appear to be attractive and therefore appear to be more trustworthy and honest. Now, the negative effect of unattractiveness on decisions of guilt has actually been evidenced in other mock trial studies. So Saladin et al. In 1988 showed participants photos of 8 men and asked these participants to judge how capable they thought this man would be of committing armed robbery and murder. These findings were that the unattractive men were considered more likely to have committed the crime than the attractive men. They identified, therefore, that there is a high probable level of prejudice occurring. In terms of accent, there's a strong focus within the research on the Birmingham accent in terms of the fact that there seems to be a much higher prejudice against people who have a Brummie accent compared to participants who had a non-Birmingham accent. Sigel and Ostro from 1975 do a really good study in order to be able to highlight this influence of attractiveness on jury decision making. Now, they asked 120 participants to make a sentence recommendation for a defendant who'd been told that they either committed burglary or fraud. Now, they were given a piece of card with a crime written on it, which either said fraud or burglary, and they were given a photo of the woman who committed the crime, known as Barbara. Now, there were a number of conditions into the research. The participants were in 6 groups of 20 participants, each being given a different experimental condition, so either attractive Barbara or unattractive Barbara, burglary or crime. Now, all the participants were asked to rate Barbara's attractiveness in order to ensure that they agreed with the decision about whether the photo showed an attractive or an unattractive Barbara. And they were then asked to give her a prison sentence for between 1 to 15 years for the crime. Now, they found that Barbara was sentenced to longer in prison in the fraud conditions and less time in prison for the burglary in the attractive photo. A similar length of sentence were given for both crimes in the unattractive or the no photograph condition. Now, this is suggesting that it is the attractiveness of the photo that does influence the decision. And there's an assumption here that attractive people, if they're seen to be using their looks to con people out of money, so for example in the fraud condition, they're actually punished harsher. So this idea that if an attractive person is being seen to use their attractiveness to help them to commit crime, then actually that attractiveness seems to go against them in terms of how the jury approach them. Although this isn't a key study, if you're talking about it within your essay, it's worth being able to evaluate it in terms of developing that AO3. It's got good controls in this in terms of there was a control group who were presented with no photograph, and they used standardised instructions in order to control extraneous variables, which make the findings more reliable. However, it isn't realistic. Juries don't decide sentences, so by asking juries to allocate a sentence between 1 and 5 years, it's actually unrealistic. We know that juries in a court of law within the UK make decisions about whether people are guilty or not. Equally, this study focuses on female attractiveness, so it doesn't take into account male attractiveness. It's also worth evaluating jury decision making in terms of pre and post trial, in terms of the information or the research that's been given, because although there is a lot of research that's been undertaken about the influence of jury decision making, there are a number of issues to consider when evaluating the reliability of these studies. So, for example, a lot of research is conducted with research participants who are often students and therefore being made to ask decisions in a mock trial. Now, this isn't representative of the sample of the population, and it certainly doesn't represent the sample of the population that make up juries. Borstein's meta-analysis of mock jury research has found that where there is little difference in the decisions of students versus non-students in mock juries, any differences that are evident suggest that students tend to be more lenient than other populations, therefore questioning the validity of this research. The information surmising a criminal offence is also presented in a written format rather than watching it unfold in a real trial, which again questions the ecological validity of the research that we're using to support our arguments. A real jury would obviously be influenced by the decision of a real judge, and this has serious consequences for a defendant. This isn't the case in mock trials, and therefore it doesn't affect how seriously the participants may be taking the experiment. So, for example, if participants know it's a mock trial, they're not going to take that as seriously as jurors in a real court of law will, which again will affect the validity of the research that we're using. Now, again, experimental research that's been done in labs can isolate variables, so it allows us to get a cause and effect relationship. It also fails to account for the fact that jury members in actual trials will be subject to a much wider range of factors that could influence their decision, and therefore lab findings into jury decision making don't have the realism of a real trial. Nementh in 1977 actually found that there was no difference in jury decision making within mock trials for those who presented in the form of a written summary or when it was staged live. Now, actually, this is good because this provides reassurances in the way that mock trials are being conducted and actually proves that the evidence from mock trials is valid and can be used to apply to real trials. In the past, real jury members have been asked to complete self-reported questionnaires after the trial has ended, and there are limitations involved in self-report data, but it does actually provide a rare opportunity for us to obtain information about the decision-making in real life. And this is likely to provide a more reliable account than that of mock trials, because asking real life jurors to provide information about what they did do, whereas in a mock trial it can only be recorded what the participant would do. I'm going to leave this here if you want to pause and have a go. This was the question presented on the sample assessment materials as an example of the type of thing that could be asked in the 16 marker based on jury decision making. You'll notice here that the AO2 is actually credited less than the AO1 and the AO3 in this question. My personal advice with this would be I would still treat it the same in terms of making sure that that AO2 is sustained throughout.